Wyoming Territory, Granite Ridge, on the Wind River Plateau, December 1887. At over 8,200 feet, winter was not merely cold, it attacked. It slipped through every crack in the logs, strangling every settler cabin built with methods their owners believed infallible. The cabins in the area were all constructed to the standard frontier pattern: hastily nailed plank walls, temporarily chinked with mud and moss, raised wooden floors for ventilation, and cast-iron Model 5 or Model 7 stoves that the Sears catalog promised could warm any cabin from Cheyenne to Cody. But Granite Ridge paid no heed to those promises. When the wind whipped down from the Wind River Range, the cabin walls began to sweat. Moisture condensed into thin frost, then thickened night after night. Ice cracked, wood cracked. The floorboards transmitted cold straight to the soles of the feet like touching the stone bottom of Fremont Lake in midwinter. The iron stove held warmth only within 3 steps. 8 steps away, the temperature plunged back below zero, as if no fire had ever burned there. On the valley's edge, amid snow-laden pines, stood the drafty little cabin of widow Eleanor Markham, 42 years old. Alone. No kin. No one knocking at her door each evening. She burned wood steadily until dawn, yet the bucket of water left on the table still froze into a frosty white layer just hours after the fire died. The cold at Granite Ridge did not merely seep into the cabin, it possessed it. The families around her were losing the same battle. The Taylors burned twice the wood, day and night, but warmth only lingered around the cookstove like an unfulfilled promise. The Rourkes ran out of firewood by mid-January, forced to break up benches and stable doors to keep the flames alive. The Macklins, most desperate of all, brought their horses inside the cabin to borrow the animals' body heat. The moist breath of the horses mingled with the smell of rotting wood and melting ice, making the cabin slightly warmer, yet almost uninhabitable for long. All of them had trusted what homesteading guides had advised for decades: build fast, burn hot, heat with iron stoves, seal drafts with mud. But Granite Ridge proved those methods worked only in easier country, not in the Wyoming mountains, where wind from the Continental Divide slashed down every night like a tireless cold blade. In that razor-sharp cold, where every cabin was losing the same way, one truth emerged as clearly as a crack in the log wall. What was called the wisdom of the frontier had betrayed them. But as the methods American frontier folk had always trusted began crumbling before their eyes, Eleanor suddenly remembered something no one in Granite Ridge had ever heeded: the ancient knowledge of her late husband's family, the Scots-Irish line from the Blue Ridge in Appalachia, who had survived damp, lingering, skin-cutting winters by building clay oven beds, heated earth beds their ancestors had relied on for generations. The difference between those two worlds lay in the fact that frontier Americans placed their faith in speed and convenience. An iron stove heated fast, enough for them to feel they had done it right. But Eleanor understood, and Samuel had repeated it often, that fast heat was not lasting heat. A Model 5 or 7 stove could warm a room in an hour, but it lost heat the moment the fire died. It heated the air, and air betrayed people overnight. By contrast, the Appalachian clay oven bed worked on entirely different logic. It heated slowly, even very slowly. But once the clay and cobblestones inside had absorbed enough heat, they held warmth steadily for 10 to 14 hours, even long after the fire was out. It was not the blazing hot in a moment that frontier folk favored. It was steady, reliable warmth, like the slow, even heartbeat of a house. Samuel Markham, Eleanor's late husband, had been a potter, and his pottery work had given him an understanding of earth that few men in the West possessed. Before he died, Samuel always carried a small cloth-bound notebook in which he recorded techniques learned from his own father: how to mix clay with straw for strength without cracking, how to create long flue channels several feet long running beneath the bed surface to carry hot gases, how to use the slow draft method, a small but steady airflow to maximize stove efficiency without burning excessive wood. He used to say, "Earth holds heat the way it holds memory. You just have to know how to make it remember longer." When the Granite Ridge wind howled through the door cracks and the thin ice on the water bucket formed once more, Eleanor suddenly realized that what Samuel had left her was not merely the memory of a potter's life, it was survival knowledge. She opened the small wooden chest beneath the bed where Samuel had kept his sketchbook. The paper had yellowed, the corners smelled of smoke. The ink had blurred with time. But amid the dark smudges, the outline still appeared of something both strange and familiar. The faint drawing of a clay oven bed with a zigzagging flue system running beneath it. Eleanor's hands trembled not from cold but from realizing what every man in the valley had overlooked. They had ignored ancient knowledge not because it was wrong, not because it was inferior to modern methods. They ignored it because it took time. They chose what was simple and quick, something that could be built in 3 days, over a system that required a week of mixing clay, drying, shaping, and repairing. But Granite Ridge did not reward haste. It only rewarded understanding. A psychological impulse drove her forward. She wanted to survive this winter, but deeper than that, she wanted to prove that a frontier woman without a husband, without male help, without exceptional physical strength could still master technique, physics, and heat transfer as well as anyone. She wanted to prove that survival was not the privilege of strong men. It was the reward for those willing to think differently. But when word spread that Eleanor was gathering clay, straw, and stone to build a clay oven bed, mocking laughter erupted across the valley. Caleb Rourke chuckled loudly while splitting wood. Clay bed? That's not a heating system. That's a grave. The tailors shook their heads. Sleep on dirt to survive? No one in Wyoming has ever done that. Those words did not deter Eleanor. Because she understood something they men who believed cast iron stoves represented the pinnacle of science could not grasp. Survival did not come from brute force. It came from understanding. And understanding sometimes lay in the oldest, slowest, most ridiculed things. And then, from that faint drawing, Eleanor began work that no woman in Granite Ridge had ever attempted. She cleared one corner of the cabin, knelt on the freezing wooden floor, and with a small shovel started digging. The ground beneath was hard as rock because winter had penetrated deep into the soil, but after nearly an hour she managed the first edge of the pit. As the work continued, the rectangular pit took shape. 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, 1 foot deep, exactly the dimensions Samuel had noted in his book. This would be the heart of the heating system the entire valley was mocking. She spread a layer of rounded cobblestones across the bottom. These stones were not chosen randomly. Samuel had noted them as heat carriers, stones that distributed heat evenly when fire passed through the flues. The stones filled the pit bottom, creating a solid base. Over them, Eleanor began applying layers of straw-tempered clay. The clay was mixed according to true Appalachian technique: clay mortar, a thick mixture of clay, fine sand, and chopped straw. The straw acted as reinforcement, providing flexibility and crack resistance. When she squeezed a handful of the mix, she tested it. If it held shape but remained slightly moist, it was ready. If it cracked upon dropping, it needed more water. If it was too pliable, it needed more sand. That was the technique Samuel had passed down, something the mocking men had never known. The pit bottom was gradually covered by thick layers of clay mortar. Each one tamped firmly with a wooden block to eliminate air pockets because air pockets would crack the clay when heated. When the first layer had partially dried, she added the second, then the third. Each cycle followed the ancient process: dry, tamp, repeated until the clay formed a solid mass. Once the base was firm enough, Eleanor built the firebox, a small fire chamber at the head of the pit, using flat stones and clay mortar. The firebox was built low, just large enough for small wood, with its opening facing the cabin door for easy loading. The most critical part of the entire system now began: the shaped smoke flue running beneath the bed surface. Eleanor recalled Samuel's every explanation about the flue labyrinth, a maze that forced hot gases through multiple passages to maximize heat transfer into the earth. She created Channel 1, a straight 4-foot run carrying hot gases from the firebox into the bed mass. Then, Channel 2, a 90-degree turn left, where the gases had to slow, forcing heat deeper into the clay. Finally, Channel 3 ran long beneath the bed surface, curving gently before rising to the chimney at the rear of the cabin. That was the 3-channel structure Samuel had written. Heat must travel to stay. But theory was always easier than practice. As soon as she began testing, Eleanor discovered the flue was blocked clay she had tamped too tightly in places prevented airflow. She had to chip carefully, widening each inch with crude tools, shivering as cold air rose from the ground. On the second test, after burning for a few minutes, the bed surface cracked open in a long fissure because the clay shrank when heated. She had to break the top layer, add more sand to the mix, and replaster from scratch. On the third try, when she thought everything was sound, a section of clay flue collapsed because the clay had not dried enough to bear weight. She bit her lip, removed the entire section, reinforced it with woven willow withes as a crack-resistant frame, a tip Samuel had recorded from his own grandfather. And so it went, each small failure becoming a lesson. Each mistake made Eleanor understand earth better, heat better, her own construction better. And while she patiently corrected one error after another, familiar whispers carried outside the cabin. Caleb Rourke passed by and snorted. A woman building a heating system? Lord help her. Another shook his head. Sooner or later, that cabin will burn down. But they did not understand. Eleanor was building not with strength, but with knowledge. Not the knowledge of Granite Ridge men, but the knowledge of an entire Appalachian lineage that had survived longer, wetter winters that iron could not withstand. And every tamp of clay, every scoop of mortar, every crack and repair brought her closer to what she needed. A system that did not depend on luck or mockery. A system that could save her when Granite Ridge decided to test human limits once more. Eleanor did not stop. She learned from every mistake, and each mistake brought her one step closer to the day her clay oven bed would defy a Wyoming winter. When the flue framework was stable and the clay began to set, Eleanor finally had time to confront the larger problem, not just the clay oven bed, but the cabin itself that was fighting her. She took Samuel's old mercury thermometer, the one he had used in his kiln, and began measuring every point in the cabin like a true engineer. The corner near the door registered only 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The far corner from the stove, where the iron was supposed to radiate heat, only 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The floorboards measured 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So cold the mercury moved sluggishly as if freezing. Near the ceiling, where hot air collected, it reached 28 degrees Fahrenheit, the warmest spot in the cabin, yet still too low for a person to sleep without shivering. Eleanor recorded everything in the notebook. The cabin is not warming. It is losing the battle. Numbers did not lie. And they revealed the truth her neighbors refused to see. She began analyzing the cabin like a failed engineering project. First was wind-driven infiltration. Gusts from the Wind River Range pushed through old, dried chinking, turning the cabin into a leaking sieve. Next was the stack effect. Hot air rose through roof gaps, escaped outside, and that very escape drew cold air up from the floor in steady streams, as if the cabin were sucking cold into itself. Then came cold bridges. The raised floor, intended to be beneficial, actually drew cold from the frozen ground beneath and transmitted it straight into the living space, preventing any stable temperature. Finally, the biggest issue, zero thermal mass. Frontier cabins were designed to heat air, but air was the most treacherous medium given one draft. All warmth vanished in minutes. No adobe walls, no stone, no material that retained heat. That was why the stove could blaze, yet the cabin remained bitterly cold. Eleanor tried small measures, stuffing wool rags into door cracks, packing old shirt scraps into chinking, hanging heavy blankets on walls. All helped a few degrees, but none changed the fundamental problem. She kept the fire burning all night, every night, and still had to turn constantly to escape pockets of needle-sharp cold. Firewood vanished like water, while the cabin remained an empty wooden box absorbing Wyoming's cold. When she mentioned these small experiments to neighbors, they only laughed, as if she were being naively hopeful. "Don't bother, Eleanor. The cabin is cold because it's a cabin, it's not your fault." The words sounded like comfort but were really surrender. People in Granite Ridge had grown used to thinking cold was inevitable, and a cabin would always be just a cabin, a wooden shell that withstood what it could. But Eleanor was different. She refused to accept cold as fate. That night, looking at the numbers in her notebook and Samuel's sketch lines, she realized something the entire valley had never considered. The clay oven bed was not merely part of a heating system. It could become the center of the entire thermal system. A hot earth mass could retain heat longer than any iron stove. A steady heat source could free the cabin from constant burning. And once the clay oven bed was strong enough, The whole cabin structure could revolve around it like a new, tireless heart. That realization, simple yet sharp as Granite Ridge's cold blade, became the first major engineering turning point in Eleanor's journey. The moment that realization struck, Eleanor immediately set to work turning the cabin into a structure that cooperated with heat instead of fighting it. She began by creating a second skin wall, a new inner layer. She mixed clay with dried grass and a little sand into thick plaster and applied it directly over the old log walls. This plaster served three purposes: increasing thermal mass to retain heat longer, reducing drafts through log gaps, and stabilizing humidity to prevent walls from sweating and freezing. But clay needed time to dry, so Eleanor worked panel by panel. Plaster one section, wait for partial drying, check for cracks, move to the next. The process took hours, then days, quiet and slow but relentless the way heat itself seeps into a home. Next, she tackled the chinking, what she saw as the greatest source of drafts. She mixed clay, sand, straw, according to the ancient Appalachian formula in Samuel's notebook. Clay for binding, sand to resist shrinkage, straw for flexibility. She packed the mixture deep into every gap between logs, pressing it tight with the handle of a spoon, then smoothing it into a seamless seal. But Granite Ridge weather was unforgiving. Many sections cracked that very first night when temperatures plunged, forcing her to redo them 2 or 3 times, each time adjusting the sand and straw ratios slightly to prevent cracking. Once the walls were stabilizing, she turned her attention to the fatal flaw of every American cabin: the raised wooden floor. Nothing lost heat faster than an open raised floor. Eleanor removed floorboards one by one, exposing the cold air beneath like an ice well. She spread birch bark over the ground, a natural vapor barrier that blocked moisture and cold from rising. Then she stuffed dry straw and pine needles 6-8 inches thick between the joists, creating highly effective natural insulation. When she replaced the floorboards, she tested by placing a burning candle near the wall base. If drafts remained, the flame would lean. This time, the flame stood straight. For doors and windows, she continued addressing every tiny weakness. Eleanor sewed wool draft snakes, long fabric tubes stuffed with straw, and placed them along door bottoms. She built interior shutters from pine boards lined with wool blankets to retain nighttime warmth. Finally, she sealed all window gaps with hot pitch mixed with clay. When every wall layer, gap, floor, and window had been treated, Eleanor sat at the table, warming her hands over a candle, and realized the cabin had changed. Not spring warm, but stable, quiet, no longer pierced by knife-like drafts across her back. She remeasured points with the thermometer. The cabin had gained 10-15 degrees Fahrenheit, even without using the clay oven bed yet. That was a change no one in Granite Ridge had imagined. Simply by making the cabin retain heat, a person no longer had to burn wood to exhaustion. Eleanor opened the notebook and wrote a short line she would remember years later. If the cabin is a thermos, then the clay bed will be the boiling water. When the cabin had become more like a giant thermos than a flimsy wooden box, Eleanor returned to the most important part, the clay oven bed, the engineering heart in which she had placed all her hope. She began assembling the complete system exactly as recorded in Samuel's notebook. First came the firebox, a 20 times 16-inch fire chamber, small enough to conserve wood, yet large enough to create a steady heat flow. She built its frame with flat stones, sealing every joint with clay mortar to prevent any cracks that might let hot gases escape the wrong way. From the firebox, she connected the flue channel, a hot gas duct running in shape beneath the bed surface. The total length of the flue system reached 16 feet, designed to curve and twist so the hot gases had to slow down, transferring heat into the surrounding clay for as long as possible. She coated the entire flue walls with clay mortar, a 4-inch inner layer to retain heat, a 2-inch outer layer for strength and crack resistance. On the very top, she laid flat stone slabs she had spent days gathering from the surrounding forest, then covered them with another layer of clay to create a smooth bed surface that distributed heat evenly. Every detail was calculated as part of a complete system, not a patchwork. And Eleanor knew that when facing a Wyoming winter, every detail had to be right. But the journey to that rightness was anything but simple. On the first test, Eleanor lit the fire. Smoke immediately backed up into the cabin. She coughed violently, eyes stinging. Conclusion: the flue was too narrow. Airflow could not escape as designed. She chipped at each clay section with a small knife, widening it by a few inches. On the second test, after the bed surface warmed for a few minutes, a sharp crack rang out. A long fissure ran across the top. The clay had shrunk from lack of sand. She had to scrape off the top layer, mix more sand into the clay mortar, and replaster from scratch. On the third test, when she thought everything was sound, a section of clay flue suddenly collapsed because the clay was not dry enough to bear weight. She bit her lip, removed the entire section, reinforced it with a woven willow frame, and replastered. That night, her hands bled from dry clay rubbing against her skin. On the fourth test, everything seemed smoother. But when she measured the bed surface temperature after nearly 2 hours of burning, the thermometer read only 35 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the cabin floor, but far from what she needed to survive. Eleanor did not give up. She studied Samuel's drawing closely and noticed a note he had written. If heat moves too quickly, add stone to slow its memory. She understood. The gases were moving too fast. On the fifth test, she added a stone core, small stones, placed alongside the flue to absorb and release heat gradually. She also applied an extra reinforced clay mortar layer for structural stability. When she lit the fire again, the difference happened. After 90 minutes, the bed surface reached 58 degrees Fahrenheit, noticeably warm to the touch. The cabin, usually below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, now rose to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. No more needle-like stinging when breathing. No more cold creeping up her legs. No more death by freezing lurking at the door. It was not just an improvement, it was a leap. That evening, Eleanor decided to sleep on the clay oven bed for the first time, something she had not dared before. She lay down, pulled her thin blanket over her, and waited. For the first time in months, her breath did not turn to frost. The paper-thin blanket felt warm. The cabin was utterly silent, no wind whistling through log cracks, no walls creaking and popping, only the soft, dying crackle of the fire in the firebox, warm like someone's heartbeat close to her ear. In the darkness, Eleanor reached out and touched the clay surface, still holding heat beneath her back. A rush of emotion hit her like a shift in the wind. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Samuel, we did it." It was her first quiet victory unwitnessed by anyone, yet enough to spark a new confrontation between a lone widow and Wyoming's harshest winter. But before the technical miracle could settle into joy, nature decided to deliver its true test. An Arctic storm that Wind River locals called the Cutter slammed into Granite Ridge earlier than any forecast. Within hours, winds screamed over the mountains like metallic howling, temperatures plunged to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind chill reached -70 degrees Fahrenheit cold that could freeze blood in the lungs with prolonged breaths. Granite Ridge residents had never seen anything like it. Traditional cabins began growing 4-inch ice layers on the inside walls where human breath moisture condensed and froze solid. Log cabins, long considered rugged, cracked with dry, sharp snaps. Wood shrank in the deep cold, chinking popped out of gaps, and wind sliced through like thin blades. In those conditions, the system the entire area relied on, the iron stove revealed its clear limits. People burned wood until the stoves glowed red, flames casting fierce light on the walls. But when Eleanor passed a neighbor's cabin, she heard them complain that the thermometer still read only 10 degrees Fahrenheit, despite 3 hours of constant fire. Heat dissipated before reaching 5 steps away, vanishing into air as cold as solid ice. Around the stoves, adults and children huddled together by survival instinct. Outside the Taylor cabin, children's cries pierced the wind as a gust ripped away a section of chinking. The Taylors took turns staying awake all night, not from lack of wood, but from fear their children would freeze to death if they dozed off for even 10 minutes. The fire could not save them, the roof could not shelter them, and all the frontier wisdom they had trusted their whole lives began to crumble. But that same howling night, Eleanor's cabin lived by different rules. Her clay oven bed maintained a steady 60 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface heat, absorbed by the clay and released evenly, without fluctuation, without needing constant feeding. Without burning all night, the cabin stayed at 40-45 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for an adult to sleep without shivering, warm enough for water not to freeze, warm enough to preserve life on days when nature seemed intent on erasing human presence. Most importantly, she used only about 1/3 the firewood of the Rourke and Taylor families. Every log she burned converted into useful heat, not blown away by wind. Those numbers were not mere luck. They were proof of a principle Samuel had passed down and that Eleanor now fully grasped. Late that first storm evening, as she recorded in the notebook, she wrote a line later regarded as the simplest scientific explanation of the system. The colder the thermal mass starts, the longer it takes to charge. But once charged, it holds heat better than anything else in the cabin. The clay and cobblestones under Eleanor's bed had been fully charged before the storm. They did what an iron stove could not: provide slow but certain warmth, provide modest but lasting warmth, provide life, not illusion. That night in Granite Ridge, while other families huddled around iron stoves waiting for the cold to shatter their last hope, Eleanor's cabin stood quiet, unshaken, uncracked, unpanicked. And in the storm's grip, the clay oven bed they had once mocked was proving that a widow's understanding could defeat a Wyoming winter. But as the storm stretched into the third day, then the fifth, then the eighth, the most horrifying part was not the cold, it was the cascading collapse of every cabin in the Granite Ridge community. The Rourkes were the first to cry for help. Their water bucket, placed right beside the iron stove, still froze into an opaque white block, something they had believed could never happen if the fire was burning. Their 7-year-old daughter, little Anna, suffered frostbite on her fingers from sleeping too far from the fire near the window where -60 degrees Fahrenheit wind lashed like an iron whip. The Taylors fared worse. Chinking had popped out almost entirely as the logs shrank in the freeze, creating long gaps wide enough to see moonlight through. Wind screamed through each slit like metal, scraping metal, blowing out candles, whipping aside blankets they tried to stuff in the holes. Every gust was a knife cut across faces and backs, leaving only burning pain. The Macklins, once proud of their tightly built roof on the 6th afternoon, heard roof beams begin to bow, then crack under nearly 3 feet of packed snow. The roof groaned like a dying animal. Matt Macklin had to bring the horses inside again for extra warmth, but that only increased moisture, forming ice on the ceiling and adding weight. By the 7th day, the valley echoed only with storm howl, wood snapping, and muffled weeping. People began burning everything they had saved for their new lives: tables, chairs, bed frames, cabinets, even wall planks from their own cabins. Every cabin smoked heavily, but heavy smoke did not mean warmth. It only showed how much wood was being swallowed uselessly. A 48-year-old man named Avery collapsed while splitting wood in -50 degrees Fahrenheit wind. His hands purple, his final swing went astray and struck his boot. When others dragged him inside, he whispered, "I can't do it anymore. I have nothing left to burn." Children throughout the valley cried all night, their wails carrying so far that Eleanor, in her own cabin, heard every ragged breath through the deep snow. Those sounds pierced the warmth of her clay oven bed like a guilty knife. And then, as each cabin began to lose faith, people started remembering what they had mocked Eleanor for: the woman digging a pit in her cabin, the widow kneading clay like pottery, the lady building a clay oven bed they had called a grave bed. Now every mocking word returned like a taunting echo in their despair. They whispered to each other, maybe she was right. But for Eleanor, the greatest struggle was not technical. It was in her heart. She heard the knocking on the 8th night. She heard the children crying. She knew they were the same people who had stood outside her fence laughing at her all autumn. She stood silent for a long time, hand on the door latch, heart aching and heavy. She wondered whether she should open the door to them, those who had called her crazy, who had said she was digging her own grave. But then she closed her eyes, listened to the wind howling through the valley, like the cry of people nearing despair. And she said softly, like an unchanging truth of frontier life, "Cold doesn't care who was right or wrong." She opened the door. Warm light from the clay oven bed spilled out like something the entire valley had forgotten existed long ago. Hope. When the darkness of the 8th day hung thick as cold storm ash, Eleanor had just dozed off when frantic knocking rang out, not wind, but desperation made flesh. She walked to the door, drew the latch, and the moment it cracked open, wind slapped her face like shattered ice. On the porch stood Caleb Rourke, the man who had mocked her the most, the one who had said, "A widow's dirt bed is only fit for burying," not sleeping. Now he shook uncontrollably, coat stiff with ice, cradling 7-year-old Anna, purple and listless from cold. "Eleanor, please, let us in." The girl. "She can't take any more." Caleb choked out as if swallowing frozen stone. Less than 10 minutes later, the Taylors appeared, faces chalk white, hands wrapped in rags around gaps where chinking had fallen out. Then the Macklins, leading their panicked horse still panting from the roof-cracking sounds. All stood in -60 degrees Fahrenheit wind like souls driven by the storm to Eleanor's door. She flung the door wide without hesitation. Wind blasted in for a moment, then stopped as if blocked by the warmth at the threshold. When the first people stepped inside, they froze in stunned silence. No one could believe they were standing inside a frontier cabin during an Arctic storm. The air was warm enough that they removed scarves and hats. No ice-coating interior corners, no smoke hanging thick like in their own cabins. Then they saw the clay oven bed, the thing they had ridiculed, pointed at, called a grave inside the house. Its smooth clay surface radiated steady warmth, not harsh, not blazing, but warm like a hot spring in winter. A long moment of silence stretched, as if every mistaken belief crystallized in the thinning frost. Caleb tremblingly reached out and touched the surface. At first, he barely brushed it, as if afraid it would burn, then pressed his whole palm down and closed his eyes. After a long breath, Caleb broke into heavy, choking sobs. "Just clay, and it saves lives." No one answered. There was no need. The truth was clearer than any explanation. The clay oven bed held steady at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while cabins around it hovered at 10 degrees Fahrenheit and slid toward death. They had laughed. Now they lived because of it. Within half an hour, Eleanor's cabin held 11 people crammed together. The Rourke family, the Taylor family, the Macklin family, and the solitary man Avery, whom Eleanor had to support because he had almost no feeling left in his hands. They sat on the floor, on chairs, leaning against the clay-plastered walls she had spent weeks applying. In the warm glow of the clay bed, they looked around a cabin they had previously barely glanced at for 5 seconds. They saw the thick plaster, saw no drafts, saw no breath frost, saw the floor no longer radiating cold. And for the first time in the storm, they drew long breaths without shivering. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Tonight they survived because of the woman they had mercilessly mocked. What they had dismissed as a joke was survival science they had never understood. And what they had scorned had become the only place in the valley still holding life. And in that small cabin amid Granite Ridge, a community was quietly rebuilding its faith around a 60 degrees Fahrenheit clay bed, the bed of widow Eleanor Markham. When the storm finally withdrew from Granite Ridge after 11 brutal days, leaving snowdrifts tall as fortress walls and scattered broken cabins in the valley, the community dared to emerge from fear. They gathered at a high point near the frozen creek to count survivors. 19 people in the settlement had endured the historic cold, and in that list the name that caught in everyone's throat was none other than Eleanor Markham, the woman the entire valley had once ridiculed. They looked around, assessed the damage, and the truth emerged as stark as the storm itself. Only Eleanor's cabin suffered no structural damage, no cracked walls, no sagging roof, no popped chinking, no broken door hinges. That cabin stood defiant, as if unaware it had just weathered what Wyoming newspapers later called the 11-day Arctic siege. That afternoon, a community meeting was held inside that very cabin, not because it was the largest, but because it was the only one still warm and safe enough for people to sit long without violent shivering. Residents crowded on chairs, on the floor, leaning against clay-plastered walls, listening in complete silence as Eleanor stood beside the clay oven bed and explained in a calm, clear voice. She spoke of thermal mass, how clay absorbed heat and released it slowly over many hours. She described airflow, how cold drafts were eliminated when the cabin was fully plastered and rechinked. She explained clay heat retention, something an iron stove could never achieve because it heated air, not solid matter. Younger people hurriedly scribbled notes on paper with charcoal, afraid to miss a word. The older ones, they did not write. They only sat quietly, eyes fixed on cabin corners, nodding slowly. One old man whispered as if speaking to someone far away, "We forgot the knowledge of our fathers." No one argued. They all felt a quiet shame mixed with deep gratitude. Within 2 weeks after the storm, the first 4 cabins in the valley began digging foundations, replastering walls, building flue systems, and constructing Markham clay oven beds, a name the residents gave it themselves, never something Eleanor had considered. A surveyor sent from Lander to assess post-storm damage stepped into Eleanor's cabin, touched the still warm bed surface, though no fire had burned since the previous night, and was so stunned he demanded to remeasure with his own thermometer. The following week, in the Fremont County Winter Survival Bulletin, the technique of an Appalachian widow was officially recorded for the first time as a recommended model for high-altitude Wyoming. But the story's impact went beyond technique. It spread into a profound cultural conversation about America itself. People began debating, why did we cling to iron stoves when they clearly failed? Why did Appalachians know how to survive winter while we dismissed their knowledge? A teacher in Fort Washakie wrote in a letter to the local paper, "The frontier believed in speed. Appalachia believed in endurance. And in the storm, only one stood firm." Modern American audiences looking back can see clearly the frontier survival style, fast, makeshift, trusting brute strength, does not always conquer nature. But immigrant knowledge, ancient knowledge, dismissed knowledge, sometimes that is what keeps people alive. And it all began with one widow, one clay bed, and the stubbornness to go against an entire community's laughter. Many years later, when Granite Ridge was no longer a chaotic frontier but a small way station for travelers between Lander and Dubois, Eleanor Markham's cabin still stood exactly as it had in her lifetime, unbowed, uncracked, unrotted, a paradox that made every passerby pause longer than a breath. Travelers often touched the time-hardened clay plaster and said in amazement, "This lasts longer than wood." While dozens of log cabins around the area had collapsed, been replaced, or been taken by storms, Eleanor's earthwork, once called Madness, had become the longest surviving structure in the entire valley. And then the story seeped into the region's collective memory. Anna Rourke, the 7-year-old who suffered frostbite in that storm, grew up to become a mountain nurse. And wherever she went to care for patients, people said she told Eleanor's story as a reminder never to dismiss old knowledge. A teacher at the small school in Lander wrote in a winter essay assignment for students, "She did not just create heat, she created hope." Each telling, each retelling, each version of the story passed from generation to generation like an unquenchable fire. When the community finally decided to erect a small sign in front of the cabin made of pine, letters deeply carved, they debated long over what words could fully capture her. In the end, they chose a line so simple it hurt. She warmed a valley with her bare hands. No one objected, because it was not only true, it was her legacy. And in the modern era, where America loves speed, quick fixes, steel and electricity and machines, Eleanor Markham's story becomes even more vital, because she proved a seeming paradox that is absolutely true. Not every innovation is new. Some things that saved people long ago and will save us again if we look back. Her legacy is not just the clay oven bed, not just the cabin warmed through -70 degrees Fahrenheit nights. Her legacy is the reminder that in a vast and ever-changing country like America, sometimes the most enduring thing is the conviction of a widow daring to trust ancestral understanding even when an entire valley laughed. And when winter winds blow through Granite Ridge again, people still say that if you press your ear to the earth walls of that cabin, sometimes you can hear the warm crackle of a very old fire, the fire Eleanor kindled not only to warm herself, but to warm an entire land. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe so you don't miss other humane survival journeys. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next video.